This meeting is being recorded.
Good evening. Welcome to the monthly meeting of Friends of Philadelphia, Adult Education Series. We're recording this on July 23rd, 2023. My name's David Unkovic. I'm an attender at the monthly meeting of Friends of Philadelphia, which meet at the Arch Street Meeting House at 4th and Arch Street in Philadelphia. And today we're very lucky to have with us an author who has written a book about Quakers. This is the book. It's called Prisoners of Congress, Philadelphia's Quakers in Exile, 1777 to 1778. And the author is Ned Donahue, who's sitting here with me. So we're going to talk about his book, and we welcome questions along the way or at the end for anybody who wants to jump in. So please do so. I would just mention Lois Wickstrom is the producer of these monthly sessions and does a great job with that. And my son Alec was our engineer today and got Ned and me up and running, because it would take more than two old lawyers to get us on this Zoom properly. So, okay, so Ned, welcome, and
Thank you,
tell us a little bit about your personal and professional background.
Well, I was raised in rural Chester County, specifically Edges Mill outside of Downingtown, and then later in Westchester, the county seat. And then after college at Williams College in Massachusetts, I went to Duke University Law School, and eventually was hired by a Philadelphia law firm. And that began 34 years of law practice in Philadelphia. And in high school, many of my classmates were Quaker. Some were descended from Quakers, but no longer Quaker. And when I went to Philadelphia in law practice, I found several Quaker clients at a big law firm, and that was always interesting. And some of my partners were descended from long lines, as many as 10 generations of Quakers. Among them was Isaac Clothier, Philip Price, and Minter Wright, who had a long and interesting ancestry in Quakerdom, but were no longer Quakers. And when I retired from law practice early, I went to work. I was recruited by the Philadelphia Orchestra to serve as a fundraiser for their endowment campaign at the beginning of the 21st century. And it was a job I dearly loved. But after 5 years of that, I retired again because I wanted to research history and write. And when I researched my own family history, I found that my mother's immigrant ancestor in 1750 came through Philadelphia and ended up in Hagerstown, Maryland. But later in life, he bought several land tracts from Henry and Elizabeth Drinker. The land tracts were in Bedford County. I'm sure Henry Drinker never saw those land tracts, but this was how he made his living after the Revolution. And in 1803, my ancestor's son went to Philadelphia to pay off the mortgage on Dad's land tracts. And when he knocked on the Drinker door, they invited him in for breakfast with the family. And this is recorded in Henry Drinker's account records at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and in Elizabeth Drinker's 49-year diary on page 1677, volume 3 of her published diary that is 2,200 pages long, published in 1991. And the Drinkers became a big focus, and they were what drew me into the Quaker exile story.
Great. So give us a very short description of what the book's about, and then we can get into more details.
Okay. Well, right before the British Army invaded Pennsylvania in 1777, the Continental Congress, led in part by John Adams of Massachusetts, recommended that the Philadelphia Patriot leaders round up, arrest, and send into exile in Virginia the leading members of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting of the Religious Society of Friends. They not only refused to bear arms, these friends, they refused to sign an oath of allegiance to the new government, and also refused to help prepare the city to defend itself against the invasion. They also questioned even the legitimacy of the duly elected government of Pennsylvania under the 1776 state constitution. While an invasion was imminent, the Quaker citizens refused to cooperate. It was a local rebellion within a colonial rebellion. Many people were provoked by the Quakers' refusal and contrary attitude. What's unusual about this story is that it's an untold story since 245 years when this episode occurred. Some few people have heard of the Quaker exile. Some know a sliver of it. There's been about 15 journal articles written about it, but nobody's written a comprehensive story and a book of it until mine came along.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. You want to say any more?
Well, I just wanted to say that at first I thought I had an inconsequential, interesting little tidbit. But scholars seem to agree now that it is an important story of the founding years and the second and third years of the new republic. The founding years have been so picked over by assiduous historians that it is extremely rare to find such a first-class story of the American Revolution that has really never seen the light of day before. And I feel quite fortunate and privileged to have found such a story, and honored to be the one to bring this story to a wider audience, because I really think it says a lot about us and about Quakers and about the American Revolution. So that's my story.
Thank you. Okay, so that's a summary of the book. Is there anything else you wanted to say about what led you to write the book? I know you've talked about that a little bit so far.
Well, there's one coincidence that proved to me in a strange way that it was as if it was my destiny to tell this story. After I finished writing the book, I found evidence that made me realize that the rural 18th century stone house that I grew up in my first 6 years was owned in the 18th century by a Quaker couple, Robert and Rachel Valentine, who on April 28, 1778, hosted Henry and Elizabeth Drinker, the central figures of the book. I never knew this until I finished the book. Henry and Elizabeth Drinker were coming from Lancaster, where Henry was released from exile, and going back to Philadelphia home, and they stopped in Downingtown, and the Valentines hosted them. Whether it was in the exact building that I grew up in, I don't know, because the Quaker couple, who were a minister and a elder, owned about 6 stone houses. Anyway, I found it was beyond coincidence. It was uncanny, but also typical of the kind of good things that happened to me through writing the book.
That's great. Is that house still there?
It is, and I've visited it since. And it's a charming little village of 6 or 7 stone houses converted into nice residences for today.
Okay. So when the Revolutionary War started in 1775, what choices did Pennsylvanians have to make? And how were these choices different between Quakers and non-Quakers?
Well, the choices for men were to fight or supply a person to fight in your place, a substitute. Or thirdly, to pay a sum of money sufficient to the militia to hire your substitute. But Quakers then could not, in good conscience, do any of these. To do so would violate what they viewed as their sacred peace testimony not to learn war. Now, it was worse for Quakers than the usual people, because if the government or the soldiers came and seized your crops or your livestock, they offered compensation for them. Usually you got to slip a paper, show up at the military headquarters, and you'll get paid something. Well, Quakers couldn't do that either. Their meetings told them to accept it would be to taint them with participation in the war. If they did, their fellow Quakers would send a committee to their house and ask them to give the money back and repent. If they would not do so, then they would disown the person, meaning involuntarily terminate that person's membership in the Quaker meeting. Hundreds of people were disowned by Quaker meetings during this time period. So if they accepted the money, they risked being disowned. And if they refused to accept the money, then they had less money and no more crop or no more livestock to sell to feed and clothe their family. So they were whipsawed at this time. The rural Quaker farmers were really in a bad place.
I remember at one point in the book, you talked about blankets. And so
Right.
What did blankets have to do with all this?
Well, that's how could blankets become an instrument of war? Well, the American Continental Army soldiers were pretty poor at that time, and they didn't have any uniforms or supplies, or, for a long time. And many of them didn't have a blanket to sleep in the field. So the Pennsylvania government would send militia members to the house. Ma'am, we're here to get the blankets. If you want to volunteer some blankets to the army, we'll collect them and we'll give you this little slip for £2 to be paid later. And the elite Quakers in the book here refused every time the militia came to the door for such kind of requisitions for war material. And the importance of a blanket, of course, was that if you got a good sleep the night before, you could fight better than the next day. So having a blanket was a real help to the soldiers if they could get them. And at one point, General Schuyler asked the Philadelphia Quakers for 1,000 blankets. And he said, "Oh, we know you don't fight, but we appreciate everything you've done, and you always cooperate fully with everything." But the Quakers said, "No, we cannot do anything in this regard. That would taint us with war." And when it got back to General Washington, he was peeved. And there were a lot of instances like that when Washington was leading a campaign in Pennsylvania against the British, and he got no cooperation from the Quakers.
Okay, so my next question follows up on that. How were the Quakers viewed and judged by the Patriots and by the Loyalists? And whatever these opinions were they justified? And was it possible or difficult for a Quaker to be neutral during the war?
Well, it was difficult to be neutral. The Philadelphia Yearly Meeting for Sufferings said that all of our 25,000 Quakers in southeastern Pennsylvania will totally be neutral and won't join either side. But people being what they are, they came to circumstances where one guy would lean this way and maybe join the British Army, and some would lean this way and they would join the Continental Army. Those who joined the Continental Army usually were disowned by their meeting when they wouldn't repent and leave that kind of employment. Non-Quakers in Pennsylvania accepted that the Quakers would not bear arms, but they expected the Quakers to pay their proper taxes and help defend the city against invasion. After all, the British weren't just invading the non-Quakers, they were invading everybody. But Quakers refused to pay taxes, which they viewed as emitted for war, and refused to give over the lead in their gutters and the lead in their tall case clocks, so the patriots could make bullets with it. Many non-Quaker patriots, including many delegates to the Continental Congress, held Quakers in utter disdain and persecuted them for not participating in the common defense of the city. Random patriots meted out shaming exercises, often against pacifists. Some would playfully, at first, cart them around the town, jeering them by singing the Rogues' March. In other ways, patriots sought through their revolutionary committees to humiliate the pacifists. Although Quakers saw themselves as only acting in accordance with the Bible or their religious principles, their neighbors saw them as making a political statement contrary to the cause of freedom for America from British tyranny.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's move on to the exile, which is what the book's about.
Oh,
so what levels of government were moving to exile the Quakers, and how was it done?
So in Philadelphia, there was the Continental Army meeting at Independence Hall, then called the State House, and meeting in the same building.
You meant the Continental Congress, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Continental Congress.
Yes, okay.
Continental Congress. Well, it was the second Continental Congress at that time.
Yeah.
And they met in the State House. Also meeting in the same building was the Supreme Executive Council of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. In other words, sort of like the governor, but it was a council of 12 people with an elected president and an elected secretary and a vice president. The Continental Congress had no real power to make laws or to keep the peace in an individual state. That was left up to the state. The Continental Congress was a deliberative body trying to figure out what to do, but technically they didn't have anything more than the right to recommend something. And what they recommended, that state and local governments arrest pacifists for fear that they were not really neutral, as they claimed, but were really rooting for the other side. And the Quakers never criticized the British forces, even when they cannonaded Charlestown, Massachusetts, or Newport, Rhode Island, or brought New York to its knees. There was no criticism that we know of by the Quakers of the British forces, but there was a lot of criticism by the Quakers of local governments and whatever was being done there. And even one letter I saw from the Meeting for Sufferings in Philadelphia was sent to Birmingham meeting outside of Westchester. And it said, don't cooperate with the local government. They just want to drag you into this war. So don't do that and don't do this. But they didn't say anything about what would happen when the British Army came through. And it was almost like giving them permission to cooperate with the British, which was our dear king and the British Empire that has enabled Quakers to prosper in Pennsylvania and in America. So when Congress recommended states arrest pacifists, Pennsylvania already had what I call a hostiles list of hundreds of local people hostile to the new order of things. So the governor created an arresting party of militiamen and deputized them to arrest the 41 suspects of people they thought had been acting hostile to the new order and perhaps treasonous. And unless they would sign an oath of allegiance to the new government, also renouncing any allegiance to the king, they were going to be taken downtown and kept in a temporary jail. Only a few Quakers and non-Quakers signed the oaths that they offered. The Quaker leaders, of course, did not believe in signing oaths because the Bible said not to. So they mostly all refused. The men were brought to the Freemasons' Lodge. You know, there's a big one next to City Hall now, but back then there was a smaller one on Lodge Alley, right next to between 3rd and 2nd Streets. And they kept the arrested Quakers there overnight. And for 9 days, while the government decided exactly what to do next. The Congress itself, the Continental Congress, debated 9 hours, according to a letter from Henry Lawrence, who served as president of the Continental Congress, 9 hours over what to do with the Quakers. In the end, they decided that the state would have to do what it thought necessary for the protection of the whole population. And since they did not trust the Quakers, they decided to send them out of town to a remote location where they could not easily escape or correspond with friends and allies to help them. This was to be the frontier Virginia town of Winchester, a village of 800 people, where British and Hessian POWs were kept in barracks. The Quakers were escorted to this place by 2 militia officers and 6 soldiers in a 3-week trip in carts, carriages, and on horseback. They took a circuitous route in order to avoid meeting with the soldiers of the 2 armies, because the day they were sent into exile was the same day as the Battle of Brandywine in Chadds Ford. And at Brandywine, there were 15,000 soldiers on each side, and the British won, but they did not deal a devastating blow to Washington, who lived to fight with his army another day.
But after that battle, the writing was on the wall that they were headed into Philadelphia.
They were definitely headed into Philadelphia to capture the colonial capital, where people had declared independence, had said bad things about the king. It was a particularly notorious place for them. The techniques the Patriots used to deal with the Quakers were some pretty unusual techniques. Preventive detention, in other words, arresting them before they knew of any criminal charges against them. Arrest them with the militia, not the sheriff, which was the usual way you arrested someone. Using a general warrant from the council, not a warrant from a court. They passed a new kind of law, like the kind that Parliament often used in England, called a suspension of habeas corpus, whereby the people arrested could not, in fact, challenge the arrests in a court of law, passing that law after the fact of the arrest. Thus, as we legal lawyers like to say, ex post facto, an illegal kind of law. And they obfuscated when they were challenged by the Quakers, refused to give the Quakers any hearing in their own defense. Even the British officers charged in the Boston Massacre in 1770 had been represented by John Adams, who believed, even though this was a dastardly deed that was done, these officers needed to have legal counsel, and he was there to help defend them. But when it came time to the Quakers and trying to get them out of town into an exile 200 miles away from Philadelphia, he didn't seem to have the same qualms about not giving them even a hearing in their own defense.
John Adams did not like the Quakers.
John Adams had some bad experiences with the Quakers. When he came to Philadelphia in 1774 for the First Continental Congress, he was accosted in New York on his way by some powerful people there who made jokes about how Massachusetts hanged 4 Quakers in 1660. And he didn't like that. Well, when he got to Philadelphia, one night, somebody called for an extracurricular meeting at 7 o'clock at night, and they didn't say what it was about. And he walked in, and here were 20 Quakers, all dressed in these black hats, beaver hats that they wore, and they didn't take them off inside. And they were sitting at this table, and they were there to suggest that Massachusetts ought to change its laws, not to have these anti-Quaker laws anymore. They thought in Massachusetts that Quakers were no better than dogs because they traded with the Native Americans, and most of the Massachusetts Puritans thought the Native Americans were savages, and they didn't like the way Quakers cozied up to them. There was another factor in the arrest of the Quakers. Someone forged some papers, which appeared to be the minutes of a Quaker meeting. And it was a Quaker meeting called the Spanktown Yearly Meeting in Rahway, New Jersey. On their face, these 6 papers seemed to show Quakers getting ready to give military intelligence to the British Army. But in reality, these papers were 18th century fake news. Congress insisted the newspapers publish these papers, though they were inconclusive proofs of anything, but intended to impugn the integrity of Quaker leaders. They were referred to as the Spanktown Papers. These techniques used to deal with the Quakers were not only unusual, but also illegal and unconstitutional. But the Patriots bullied the Quakers into not resisting, so they went off to exile complaining, but not physically resisting. And they knew the Quakers wouldn't resist having a militia officer tell them what to do. Only in retrospect can one see that the Patriots were unfairly treating the Quakers, but doing so because the threat coming up the road to Philadelphia was an existential threat. If the Patriots lost in a devastating way to the British, where would that leave Pennsylvania and the United States? A little long-winded, sorry about that.
No, that's good. So we've talked about habeas corpus.
Right.
What does habeas corpus mean?
Well, habeas is have, and corpus is the body. So it's as if a court said, I shall have the body brought before me, and then we shall investigate on what basis these gentlemen were arrested. And if it's an illegal basis, then they shall be released. But if it's a legal basis, they can take them to jail. So it's the bundle of rights that individuals have enjoyed since 1215, the year when King John signed the Magna Carta forced on him by the nobles. And it enabled people in Britain to expect procedural due process if they were arrested.
And this issue came up again in the American Civil War with Abraham Lincoln putting people in jail without any hearing, right?
And many people thought that that was the first time suspension of habeas corpus had ever been used.
Right.
But in fact, it was in 1777 and against these 17 Quaker men sent to Winchester, Virginia.
Okay. So the men sent, how many were Quakers and how many were non-Quakers?
So there were 20 men who were sent to Virginia with the militia, and 17 of them were Quakers. 2 of them were disowned Quakers. One was disowned for marrying out, a factor you know well, I'm sure. And the other was disowned for not paying attention to his debts while he was gambling.
Okay.
And the last gentleman in the exile was a British-born subject who was a dancing master and taught dancing in South Carolina and then in Philadelphia for all the elite families.
Okay. So I know a lot of your focus was on the Drinker family. Tell us about the Drinker family and how were they affected by the war and the exile?
Well, in the Drinker family were 11 people. Henry and Elizabeth, Elizabeth's sister, Mary Sandwith, who mostly seemed to work in the kitchen, but I'm sure helped take care of the children. There were 2 formerly enslaved African-American servants. This was a time when the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting enforced manumitting your slave, freeing your slaves. And that happened in the Drinker household. There was also an indentured servant and 5 children under the age of 7. Henry was drafted by the militia, but he refused to go or to pay the substitute tax. So periodically, the local government would send some agents over to the Drinker house, take some of his mahogany Chippendale furniture, and took it away and sold it at auction for the benefit of the government. And that was how his substitute tax was paid. When Henry was taken away into exile, his infant son was constantly crying with an ache of some kind, as young children have a want to do. Elizabeth had to fight off an intruder who was a British officer wooing Anne, the Drinker's indentured servant, and she went off with him. The soldier waved around a sword in a threatening manner and had to be pushed out of the house by neighbors. Another time, British soldiers were tearing apart the wood from a shed the Drinkers owned because all the British soldiers occupying the city of Philadelphia for 8 months would use such wood for firewood. 3 times, British officers came to the door and asked if Mrs. Drinker would kindly quarter them, lodge them in her house. She asked 3 times to be excused because her husband was, quote, away. Twice they demurred because she was a lady and of a certain elite status. But the 3rd time, the officer described himself as a man of good taste and gentlemanly ways, and he wasn't going to be rude, but he told her that you'd rather have me than some other officer who's going to come here. And he was very persuasive. And so finally she relented. When Henry heard about it, he was not happy. But Elizabeth handled it rather well and came to like the man and to have some esteem for him.
And Elizabeth kept a diary, is that right?
Elizabeth would generally go upstairs at night and write in her diary before she went to bed. And so consequently, we know what was going on in her neighborhood on a daily basis. And we know how many people in the Quaker network visited her house. Generally, it was between 12 and 20 people each day. It was a large house, and it was near the wharf where most of the Quaker merchantmen would have their work.
Where is her diary today?
Her diary today is at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1991, Elaine Foreman Crane, a wonderful PhD scholar in New York, spent 10 years editing her diary and getting it printed, and it ended up in 3 volumes of 2,200 pages.
Wow.
And it's an amazing source of good information.
Okay, I interrupted you. You were on a roll about the drinkers here.
Well, so she accepted to have Major Crammond, who was in charge of the Ansbachers among the Hessians. And he didn't just come himself. He had two German orderlies, and he had 2 cows, 2 chickens, 2 turkeys, et cetera, which he expected the kitchen to cook up for him when he brought over guests. Henry was especially concerned that his little boys not be influenced by a man of war. And this was a touchy thing. But he did have a veneer of refinement and was polite and sociable. When he finally left, he went to New York. And Elizabeth learned later that he had died after an 8-day illness. And she said, we held him in some esteem. When Elizabeth left the house to go on the women's mission, which I'll describe later, her sister reluctantly agreed to manage the house in her absence, and her absence took a month, though she was clearly overloaded with this responsibility. Another time, Henry asked Elizabeth in a letter to send him some cash money of a sizable sum, because another condition of the exile was that the exiled men had to pay their own expenses for lodging and food. The Pennsylvania government wasn't going to spend a dime on people who didn't pay their taxes. So they made the Quakers pay their own expenses. But she had to look around for about a week to find the right person to take this considerable sum of cash 200 miles to her dearly beloved husband. She finally found him, and he was a remarkable surveyor who knew the land around and knew how to get around and get things done, and he had the utmost discretion. So these things were extremely hard on the family, but Elizabeth found solace in receiving Henry's letters and in writing her own diary and letters at the end of the day. But anxiety for Henry always weighed hard on her, and sometimes she had terrible headaches because her husband was subject to a lot of minor aches and pains, and if he were home, she could take care of him, but she worried constantly that he might have a sudden illness out there in the frontier. Henry, for his part, didn't want to do anything to undermine the peace testimony, though he worried constantly that he might turn out to be a weak vessel. He was not. He withstood every hardship, and Elizabeth did too, both with great dignity and charm.
So how were the prisoners treated down in Winchester, Virginia?
It was a very loose confinement. At first, for the fall months, October, November, and December, they lived at an inn, 4 to 5 men to each bedroom. And the innkeeper was an agreeable man at the time, and they even held Quaker meetings for worship at the inn 2 times a week. And they attracted people from outside of their own circle. But some of the local people were upset because they already had all the British prisoners and Hessians in the barracks. And now here comes 20 more Tories from Philadelphia. And they were not happy about having them there. So there was a lot of tension. And meanwhile, the Quakers, they knew how to protest. It's one of the legacies of Quakers is protest. And they immediately sent a protest to the governor of Virginia as soon as they got there. And they really didn't ever receive a reply. But Patrick Henry, the governor, was not about to cater to the needs of Quakers at that time. So these were the times that tried men's souls, as Thomas Paine wrote. Henry missed serving as a husband and father to his children, who he adored. And Elizabeth missed him there, but she had, as many Quaker women had, a lot of experience making decisions on her own. And she was very decisive and very energetic, and there was nothing she wouldn't do to protect her family.
So speaking of women, one of the interesting sub-stories in your book is the women's mission. So what was that all about?
So after 6 months, when the government never relented keeping the Quaker leaders in Virginia, their women thought, the men are running out of medicines, and they were relatively old for the time. Old for the time was mid-40s. The women began to think about sending some medicines and other necessaries to them. Eventually, the women decided on a petition to political leaders, which was a big leap for women at the time. A Quaker man, a former practicing lawyer, drafted a petition for them to carry, but they rejected the text of the draft. Instead, the women alone drafted their own petition, with gendered language appealing differently than the unsuccessful petitions formerly drafted by the men. 18 women signed the women's petition, and 4 men were selected to carry it, first to General Washington at Valley Forge, and then to the state government, then in voluntary exile in Lancaster. Elizabeth Drinker was one of the women, and Molly Pemberton Pleasance another, and they traveled over muddy roads and through creeks in late winter in a carriage with 2 black male servants and a male Quaker minister. He wanted to advocate for the women, but the women told him in no uncertain terms to never attempt to speak for the women. At Valley Forge, Washington's staff had briefed him on this unusual delegation. When they arrived, he said he could not do anything for them, as the exile was the business of the state. But he invited the women to join his general staff for afternoon supper, 20 members of his general staff. Afterward, the women went up to Martha Washington's sitting room, where they chatted amiably, with tales of woe likely concerning the deaths of 2 of the Quaker men in Winchester. When the women had finished talking, Martha may have whispered to George something along the lines of, "Dear, can't we do something for these women?" In any case, the general had written a letter to the governor of Pennsylvania, and now he added 2 sentences. Quote, "The women seem much distressed. Humanity pleads strongly in their behalf." End quote. When the women reached Lancaster the next day, the government began to release the men. Their journey and how they handled their mission was a courageous act, and it will stir the passions to read how it was accomplished through persistence and a straightforward appeal. It's important, I think, to remember the names of the women's mission members: Elizabeth Drinker, Mary Pemberton Pleasance, Hannah Pemberton, Mrs. James Pemberton, and Susanna Sukey Evans Jones, Mrs. Owen Jones, the mother of one of the exiles. The petition is reproduced in full in the appendix of the book. These women were extraordinarily courageous and effective.
So they were as strong-willed as Quaker women today.
It may be, I don't know.
Okay. So how did the prisoners come to get released? How did that happen?
Well, the governor of Pennsylvania, after the deaths of 2 of the exiled men, found that some friends of independence of these states believe that their further continuance in exile serves no purpose. And unless Congress believes that some purpose remains, the men should be released by Congress to the jurisdiction of the state of Pennsylvania again. Now, someone in the legislature apparently had spoken up in defense of the Quakers, and we don't know who, and had expressed the desire that they be released after this time, and it must have come to a vote, and the legislature expressed this opinion to the executive of the state, and they had to do something. So they were escorted back to Lancaster, where the council released them by giving them a slip of paper saying they were, quote, discharged, quote, but in no way did they get the exoneration the men were seeking from the ugly insinuations arising out of the publication of the Spanktown papers in the newspapers. And the Pennsylvania Council clearly resented having to release the men who had caused them so much trouble. And they resented the fact that the release was coming before the British Army had evacuated Philadelphia, which only happened on June 18th, 1778. And they evacuated because the King of England said to them, all right, the French are in the war now. They've signed a treaty with the new states, and we've got to regroup. So get your behinds up to New York, where we can regroup and figure out how to fight off the French and the Americans. So it wasn't anything the American army had done, except that all their encounters with the British had not resulted in a devastating blow to Washington and his men. And that resonated heavily in Europe, where they thought these Americans must be really something.
Great. Why don't we pause for a second and see if there are any questions at this point? Anybody have anything they want to ask Ned?
I would like to know if you've come across Richard Stockton at all.
Richard, have you come across Richard Stockton? He was from New Jersey, right?
Yes. No, I haven't. I mean, I knew something about him. His sister's family lived over in Red Bank, New Jersey, I think, and they fought off 900 Hessian soldiers over there. But he was not part of the Pennsylvania scene.
Okay.
I read.
Because he lost everything, and he was tortured, and it was an awful story.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay.
Thanks, Susanna. Tom, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I guess just a comment. I mean, John Adams had certain autocratic tendencies that kind of manifested later in the Alien Sedition Acts. So, you know, he wasn't kind of a natural Democrat as were some of the other, you know, founders. But kind of a question in that, you know, a lot of these exiles were kind of members of the merchant elite in Philadelphia, and certainly they had strong ties with the English Quakers, who were in the process of building vast banking fortunes at the time. So, I mean, there was a real kind of mercantile interest in maintaining ties with England. So, I mean, can you comment on how that may have kind of fit into some of the resentment on the part of the, you know, John Adams and some of the other colonial patriot leaders?
Well, I think the fact that Quakers at the time were relatively insular and dealt mostly with their own kind. On the other hand, these men were major transatlantic merchants, and they had several ships plying the triangular trade, and they had fine houses in the city. And each of the major Quaker exiles had a second home in the country, had fine carriages. These were men of pretty great wealth, and there was some class sentiment against these people of wealth. But on the other hand, if the economy was to prosper, if they got away from England, they needed the economic engines that these Quakers would give them. And consequently, the Patriot government didn't go out of its way to injure or hurt these Quakers. They thought they were giving them a kindly treatment. And some people say that the Quaker exiles were really treated in a very honorable way. But I think that the psychological torture that they suffered was that they were humiliated in front of everybody in Philadelphia, and that they were shamed and made to feel as if they had done something terrible. And their point was we were just following our religious principles.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Tell us about the process of writing this book.
So on January 15th, 2014, I started to read two books. One was an 1848 book published for subscribers by Thomas Gilpin Jr. in Philadelphia called Exiles in Virginia, and reports of the conduct of the Religious Society of Friends during the American Revolution. And it contained a great deal of documents on the Patriot side showing how the Quakers were treated. And right next to it were the diary entries from these Quaker exiles who could tell you what was happening on their side. So it's a really remarkable book, but it's a bit of a jumble, and it goes from one page to the next to a different voice, a different person saying something, and you had to sort it out. But it was very dense. And of course, the Quaker language of the 18th century is kind of dense in and of itself. And I think a lot of historians didn't want to pick through that. But for me, I thought this was a labor of love for me. I just really enjoyed the way Quakers think differently than other people. And I looked forward to reading all the Quaker diaries. I think I read somewhere between 20 and 30 Quaker diaries to come up with some of the context surrounding this event. So, and the second book I read was The Virginia Exiles by Elizabeth Vining, who had been the tutor to the Crown Prince of Japan, selected by agents for Douglas MacArthur after the Second World War. And she was a writer and a school teacher, and she taught the Crown Prince everything for 5 years and forged this wonderful relationship with him, so that when he came to Philadelphia, he stayed at her house. I mean, it was unheard of. Anyway, she's a good writer, and she wrote a novel based on the facts of the Quaker exile. And she substituted a real person with a fictional person, and she created a youthful romance. And so she was biased totally in favor of the Quakers, of course, and defended everything they did and said that they were so innocent. But she really didn't take into account the greater context of the war and the politics of Philadelphia at the time. So I think both of these books were extremely useful, but they needed to be supplemented. So I thought that I did an exhaustive job of trying to find out what everybody else in the Philadelphia area was saying about the Quakers and about the Philadelphia campaign of the British, so as to bring that to bear to round out the story.
Great. So what lessons does this story hold for us today?
Oh, yeah, I wrote up a couple of lessons. So
Okay. Get your pens out here.
So I think my book proves that the Patriots were more aggressive and rougher with the pacifists than anybody previously thought. Ironically, using a page from the authoritarian playbook of the enemy, Parliament, to subdue the Quakers. The end result, saving the new republic, seemed to the patriots to justify illegal and unconstitutional means, but I leave it to the reader to draw that conclusion or not. Suspension of habeas corpus as a political technique survived the American Revolution, being placed in the US Constitution of 1787 to be used only in times of invasion or rebellion. And indeed, this case seemed to be one where there was both an invasion and an internal rebellion. It's still there in the Constitution, and if an authoritarian president came to be elevated to the chief executive's role, he might try to utilize this clause, a suspension of habeas, to stifle dissent by manufacturing a case of rebellion or invasion. Thirdly, many experts thought that the first use of suspension of habeas in the US was by President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, but my book proves it came during the Philadelphia campaign. There are many questions about the book, but the one I leave you with at the end: how did the patriots justify the seemingly blatant hypocrisy inherent in their treatment of Quakers? Were patriots guilty of overly zealous political chicanery, a betrayal of their own cause? Or were the patriots savvy strategists in finding a path to avoid collaborators causing worse harm from a tyrannical enemy, even if it meant using an illegal and unconstitutional ploy because so much was at stake? Did the ends justify the means? And you can find out about that in the book.
Okay, so speaking of the book, here it is again. So where can people buy this book?
Well, if you go to the Penn State Press website and use a code NR23, capital N, capital R, 23, at the Penn State Press site, you can get a 30% discount on the purchase of the book.
The book is also available at the Arch Street Meeting House in the entranceway. Just talk to Mark at the front desk, and he's got copies of it in the closet behind him.
And bookstores in Pennsylvania would have it, and libraries and educational institutions are going to buy some too, I think.
Great. Okay, are there any final questions for Ned as we wrap up here? Yes, Lois.
I have a question. In all the diaries that you read, did you see any Quakers have a preference for either side in the Revolutionary War?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. One time, Elizabeth Drinker sort of slips her cover and says, when the British march into town, "Oh, would the men be here and see this?" So, and then there was,
well, there's Samuel Nicholas, who's buried under the Arch Street Meeting House, who became the commandant of the Marines, the first commandant of Marines, was a Quaker. He was read out of meeting.
Right.
And there was Nathaniel Greene, who was a great general in the Continental Army, who was a Quaker.
And there was Thomas Mifflin,
Yes.
and there was Clement Biddle and Owen Biddle.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Ned, thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And Lois, do you want to wrap up here? You're on mute.
I want to thank both of you. That this has been an informative and charming evening. You guys are just fun to watch together.
Great.
You interact on a friendly and intellectual level at the same time, which definitely I appreciate, and I hope everyone else did.
Thank you.
So
I
thank you for,
want to know what you're doing next.
Well, I have several projects, one including Woodrow Wilson. So
Oh, okay.
Time will tell which one I pick up.
So is he a good guy or a bad guy?
Well,
That's what it's all about.
He was a bad guy.
Okay.
Definitely a bad guy.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Wow.